human conditions, not free market propaganda and corrupt politicians, cause they owned by special interest groups that fund their campaign. That's why you hear the same old things they claim.
Welcome to the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff. First up this week, journalist Afeef Nessouli joins the show to talk about the situation in Lebanon and how corporate media deliberately flattens and dehumanizes in service of U.S.-Israeli regional goals. Afeef explains the complex and interconnected networks of resistance and solidarity on the ground, the tangled web of imperialism, and how Lebanese journalists are, like their Palestinian counterparts, working together in impossible conditions to get the truth out about their situation in spite of compounding and violent censorship. Next up, my co-host Mickey Huff sits down with former director of student media at Indiana University, Jim Rodenbush, to talk about his termination. Jim had the audacity to stand up for the renowned student newspaper, the Indiana Daily Student, when the powers that be didn't feel it should actually report the news anymore. Jim shares his story and warns of the implications this has on everyone's access to a free press, from colleges to professional newsrooms. All this and more coming up on Project Censored.
And the mines collapsing, all the prisons build the capacity citizens, and the times when a master thief can buy and conquer, steal a masterpiece. Open your eyes and realize what's happening. Time's running out to reach all potential fame.
Welcome to the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I am your co-host Eleanor Goldfield, and here's some of the news that didn't make the news for the week of April 6th, 2026. A Tennessee bill backed by the Tennessee Department of Children's Services would allow foster children, that's children who have never been charged with a crime, to be imprisoned in juvenile detention facilities. The bill states that, quote, courts would have the authority to designate a child for the status if there is evidence the child has exhibited or threatened violent behavior similar to certain serious offenses, whether or not the child has been formally charged or found delinquent, end quote. Hey, it's pre-crime, but with kids. That's fun. Last week, the Texas State Employees Union posted that the second Texas State University faculty member has been fired for political speech. Dr. Idris Robinson was targeted for comments made during a private speech during an off-campus talk that he gave in 2024 without using his institutional affiliation. Dr. Robinson was a tenure-track professor in the Department of Philosophy, and Texas State yielded to outside Zionist pressure rather than upholding academic freedom and indeed First Amendment rights. And as we've covered on the show before, Texas is one of the states that has required Israel loyalty pledges from government employees. No such pledge exists concerning loyalty to the U.S. With all the focus on ICE, you'd be forgiven for not noticing that CBP has been spending over $7.5 billion on the border wall. Yeah, remember that old thing? According to reports analyzed by Project Saltbox, after spending roughly $2 billion a month on new border contracts in January and February, CBP more than doubled that pace in March alone. To date, CBP has committed about 40% of the more than $40 billion that it was allocated for border wall construction under the Big Beautiful Bill Act, with nearly half of those obligations made this month. Meanwhile, in collaborative reporting with a More Perfect Union, Breakthrough News ran an investigation which analyzed retirement accounts, aka 401ks, finding that roughly $543 million are invested in Geo Group and some $472 million in Core Civic, two companies that make big bucks through private prisons and concentration camps for ICE. In their post on the report, a More Perfect Union outlines steps to take to ensure that your 401k is not helping to fund these grave human rights violations. And as you sit down to eat today, consider the fact that while total farm debt has increased every year since 2012, things are about to get a lot worse. The oil crisis caused by the war on Iran will not only affect gas prices, but fertilizer prices as well. Commercial farmers rely on imported fertilizer, another issue that speaks to the absurdities of global capitalism. Fertilizer manufacturing is closely tied to oil production, and the main exporters include Iran, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Meanwhile, on the home front, there's a fertilizer monopoly, which sounds as gross as it is. 4 companies control 75% of the market, and farmers have already filed lawsuits accusing fertilizer companies of conspiring to illegally keep prices high. Oh, and tariffs. Trump's beloved tariffs have caused farm machinery prices to jump 16% and pesticides 20%. Farmers have also been forced to sell their crops for less as countries like China engage in retaliatory tariffs. When taken all together, the outlook is grim for many farmers who have yet to secure fertilizer for the season. Investigative reporting by The Intercept shows that the Pentagon is engaged in a casualty cover-up from the war in Iran. Almost 750 U.S. troops have been wounded or killed in the Middle East since October 2023, an analysis by The Intercept has found. But the Pentagon won't acknowledge it, offering The Intercept lowball and outdated figures and failing to provide clarifications on military deaths and inquiries. And with regards to the Iran war, the U.S. and Israel continue to strike civilian and cultural centers in Iran, including a century-old medical research center in Tehran and a pharmaceutical facility in western Tehran, which produces a significant share of Iran's domestic medicine supply, including antibiotics, cardiovascular drugs, and intravenous fluids used in hospital operations. These wildly illegal and psychotic attacks on healthcare infrastructure are leading to signs that Iran's healthcare system could be buckling and breaking down. Meanwhile, the U.S. military has briefed Trump on plans to seize Iranian uranium in a ground invasion. And in Lebanon, the death toll has risen to over 1,300, with more than 3,900 wounded. Our guest this week, Afeef Nessouli, will discuss the situation in Lebanon more thoroughly in ways that you'll never hear on corporate media. In occupied Palestine, Israel continues to kill and maim in the concentration camp known as Gaza and in the occupied West Bank. And while a smattering of corporate media reported on last week's Knesset vote to mete out mandatory death sentences to Palestinians found guilty of terrorism, what they haven't pointed out is basically everything. That all Palestinians are in fact tried in military courts rather than civilian ones, meaning that there's no jury or representation, that a kid throwing stones can be accused of terrorism, thereby hanged. According to recent numbers by B'Tselem, there are more than 500 children in Israeli prisons, with a total of more than 10,000 Palestinians imprisoned. There are no appeals for clemency under military occupation. So in short, what corporate media missed is that Israel has just made it official policy to murder more than 10,000 people who never received a fair trial if they want. And this comes after years of reports of extreme torture inside Israeli prisons. I'm ending on a high note again today because I think we need it. In a brilliant, if unusual, iteration of Land Back, the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma announced last week that it had purchased a former Big Lots distribution center in Durant, a 1.24 million square foot warehouse that had been under informal consideration by ICE as a potential detention site. The purchase keeps what could have been an estimated 8,500 detention beds from ICE's expanding warehouse to detention pipeline. That's some of the news that didn't make the news for the week of April 6, 2026. And now on to this week's program. Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, and we're very glad right now to be joined by Afeef Nessouli, who is a journalist with The Intercept and host of With Afeef Nessouli, a weekly live stream and interview show about suppressed news. Afeef, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for covering Lebanon and having me on your show.
Absolutely. Well, much like your show, what we try to do here at Project Censored is cover the news that didn't make the news and talk about why. So let's dive right in. I want to start with an article that you co-authored for The Intercept about a week ago. We're recording this on Monday, March 30th, so listeners are aware, where you write that, quote, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Public Health, Israeli airstrikes have killed more than 1,000 people, 118 of them children, and displaced 1 million others, end quote. Al Jazeera also reported that 99,000 homes were already damaged or destroyed in the previous 14 months before this current escalation started. So we're really talking about continuously compounding destruction and displacement. And of course, this is always done under the guise of targeting Hezbollah. Just like we saw in Gaza, it's always about targeting Hamas. But as I often like to say, like if there's an active shooter in a school, which if you're in the US, you don't really have to imagine that. Would it make sense for people to blow up the school? We wouldn't accept that. And yet, if it's Israel, we tend to accept it, or corporate media at least tends to accept it. So, Afeef, I was wondering if you could start just talking about the situation on the ground there, because this is something that media has not covered at all. And yet we're talking about numbers that I can't even really properly fathom.
Yeah, it has been extremely hard to deal with the dissonance between what was going on the ground, what's going on the ground, and what isn't being reported, and how people in the West are getting the news about what's going on in Lebanon. Yeah, like you said, so over 1 million people have been displaced. That looks like a lot of tents around the city, just propped up outside of the park, which is where I was living the last few months. It's sort of butts up against the southern suburbs. It's right north of the southern suburbs. So it was really loud. There was a lot of families, just intense, struggling. So over 1 million people have been displaced from the south and the southern suburbs. Over 1,200 people have been killed. And I think the thing that happens, I mean, it's hard to put it so reductively, but it feels right. It's racism. Like, people think that this is okay and normal in Lebanon, but every time something like this happens, it's extremely tragic. It's like the first time, and it's panic and it's tragedy. And so I think what ends up happening is, in the West, it's easy to say, oh, this is the sort of thing that happens in Lebanon. They're just trying to get Hezbollah. And like you said, when they're targeting residential buildings, when they're killing medics, journalists, when they're causing all of us psychological terror with sonic booms and extremely loud drones and missile strikes, it's not really about Hezbollah. It just isn't anymore. And even if it were specifically about Hezbollah, like you said, all of this stuff is illegal. It's illegal war. It's illegal warfare. So it's hard because you see people suffer, and then you don't really hear about the fact that there should be boundaries to suffering in the news. And it's why we try to get on the ground and report and amplify people's voices, like who are displaced, who have been on the streets. So I spoke to like over 36 people who are displaced in the streets and shelters, people who are running shelters, people who are running initiatives to like pass food out, because all these people really want to make sure that although all of the structures above them, whether they're international structures or even just national structures, although they're failing them, they're really committed to each other still. And I think that that's part of the news that I think does get censored, is that there are people on the ground that are incredible. And those people are also resistance. You know, there's a larger umbrella of resistance that occurs in these areas. And it's not always armed. Sometimes it's just a bunch of 25-year-olds making nearly 1,000 meals and passing them out because that's what they're doing for the next few weeks, because they don't feel like they can do anything else with their bodies.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to highlight the diversity of resistance. And I kind of want to get into this a little bit because, as you said, not only is it considered to be like, oh, that's just what happens there, which I always thought was funny, because it's like, okay, but if you then do the next level of media literacy or just critical thinking, but why? And then it always ends up being this quote unquote West, right? Either it's Israel or you have the actual West. You've got the US, the UK. So the quote unquote violence that just always is there, it's like, but that's somebody's fault.
Mm-hmm.
And it traces back to the so-called West and the colonial core. But with regards to the diversity of resistance on the ground and kind of like the diversity of, you know, feelings, I know that nobody's a monolith. There's no such thing as a people that's a monolith. And Israel's tactic has been to try and sow sectarian distrust and even violence in Lebanon, dropping leaflets, you know, asking people to condemn neighbors for being in or supporting Hezbollah and things like that. So could you talk a little bit about the feeling on the ground vis-a-vis Hezbollah and the Lebanese government, and how these institutions are dealing with Israel and how the people feel about those dealings?
Yeah, it is super complicated in Lebanon, but the truth is that the Lebanese street is sophisticated and can hold a lot of things at once, right? Like Hezbollah vis-a-vis Israel is the resistance. They're on the front line. Everybody understands that without them, the South would have been occupied. But for them, the South has been occupied and continues to be threatened to be occupied. So there is a level of deference to families being displaced, and their support for Hezbollah is understandable. There's also an anger about the fact that there were a lot of ceasefire violations in the last year. Israel brokered a so-called ceasefire, or they didn't broker it, but a ceasefire was so-called brokered, and then it was just constantly broken. And Hezbollah didn't really respond too quickly to the breaks, but did to Ali Khamenei's assassination. So there are a lot of people in Lebanon who are a little angry about that. We're like, well, do you care about Lebanon, or are you just a proxy for Iran? But again, when you filter it out to the West, it becomes this thing that's like not as sophisticated, where it's like pro, anti. And the truth is that Lebanon has always been just a playground for regional and international superpowers to do whatever they want. So what that means really is that before Hezbollah ever existed, Israel was doing incursions in the south and causing havoc and killing people. So it's not lost on the Lebanese street that the whole point is to destabilize the country. The regional powers, whether it's Iran or Israel or large powers like the United States or France, the point is to pour in money and arms into their group of representatives on the ground, make sure that their group can do their bidding. And what that looks like is a lot of local Lebanese people fighting each other over things that are way larger than their capacity, which is 1 million people are displaced. Now you have all of these people in your neighborhood and you're afraid that maybe they support Hezbollah, which the problem is that if they're perceived as that, then the likelihood that they're getting targeted and therefore you're being targeted increases, which is a rational thing to think. Even if it looks really racist and sectarian, it becomes this thing of survival where you're saying, well, Israel seems to be targeting residential buildings in central Beirut. They're targeting medics and journalists. Like, I spoke to a woman. She's actually a Lebanese American student at the American University of Beirut. She just moved there in August. She took in 12 of her family members from the South because she's Shia and she comes from the South originally. And she has had 12 of her family members move into the east side of Beirut, which is predominantly an upper class and Francophile. And she's gotten so much, there's been so much tension. Many threats have been made to, like, you know, the neighbors send us over, checking things out, wanting to be like, wait, we're going to, like, basically report you to the municipality. And it's because they're afraid. They're genuinely afraid. And it's not to justify their fear or say, hey, that sectarianism is okay. It's that there's literally bombs going off. So she understands that, yeah, actually her family is kind of pro-Hezbollah, and that's not an abnormal thing to be. So, you know, doesn't mean that they're going to be, you know, they're not soldiers at Hezbollah. They're like literally like from the South, and that is their political representative. So there are all these layers going on where, like you said, also these leaflets being thrown into Hamra, which is northwest Beirut. You know, when I was there, you look at it, and on one side it's threatening us that they're going to make Beirut Gaza, and they're going to destroy it like they destroyed Khan Yunis, which is, you know, a lot of Lebanese people will say, hey, like, the Israelis lie a lot, but when they say they're going to do something nasty, they usually aren't lying. So that's terrifying. And then the other side of the leaflet is a QR code that says, you know, log in and inform on your neighbors. Lebanon is yours. You deserve to have Lebanon be yours. And, you know, there's a lot of people who they're vulnerable to that kind of language because they're like, we've been dealing with hyperinflation since 2020, port explosion, all of this incredible corruption that is based on leadership that's not just Hezbollah, but all of the leaders in Lebanon that are kind of co-opted by either Iran or Saudi or America or whatever or what have you. So you have all of these people who are just tired. They're so tired, and the easiest thing to do is to blame each other, because what are you going to do? Blame Israel for being psychopaths? Like, you can't, like, you're like, they're psychotic, but like your neighbor is this person who's in front of you, and it's easier to express angst, express sectarianism, because it's a trigger that's been there for decades and has been poked at and prodded into because of material loss. Everybody has been in an extreme loser in Lebanon. In one way or another, they've lost family, they've lost houses, they've lost money. And it's all because of a system that doesn't really care about them. It really only cares about what their land, what their water, and what their space can do for others. So right now you just have a really tense and chaotic situation, as on top of just a country being bombed senselessly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm glad that you mentioned that, you know, it's so layered. And again, I think this is one of those things that, well, we accept a layered reality when it has to do with the US and even a little bit Europe. But certainly it becomes very flat and flimsy if we're talking about the so-called Middle East. And I mean, we don't talk about Africa, but if we did, if and when we do, right, it's also, again, like very, very flat and flimsy. And that, of course, then speaks to this idea, this concept that, oh, well, the people must also be flat, flimsy, simple, savage, et cetera, and promotes that the continued dehumanization. And I mean, you've mentioned a couple of times journalists and first responders, and I just want to mention, if folks weren't aware, that over the weekend, Israel targeted, as they've done many times, 3 Lebanese journalists, Fatima Fatouni, her brother Mohammed, and journalist Ali Shoab. And these are the same kind of targeted murders of journalists that we've seen in Gaza for the past 2.5 years, but also throughout occupied Palestine for the 70 whatever years before this current genocide began. I was wondering if you could also talk about what it's like to be reporting in Lebanon right now, understanding that this is, like you said, the leaflets say we're going to turn this into Gaza, but it seems to be that this was already an understanding by Lebanese journalists that when you put on that press jacket, you're not protected. It's rather a target because Israel has this long history of targeting these reporters and truth tellers.
Yeah, I think that it's really important and we forget, but it's hard to remember that Israel was actually really founded on like Irgun, Haganah, Stern Gang. The concept of Israel has been problematic from it's just the start of it. So to report on something as problematic as that is really an existential threat to their entire project. So journalists in Gaza or journalists in Lebanon or journalists around the region, even in Israel on the West Bank, occupied Palestine, the stakes are high because as an Arab, as a Lebanese American, I personally have I can tell you how my family has lost from Israel. So these journalists have a personal stake in resisting propaganda, which is essentially what any Lebanese or Palestinian journalist is in to begin with, because it's not like this incredibly thankful job where you're making money. Like you're doing it because you know it's the right thing to do. And these journalists, whoever they were reporting from, whether it was Mayadeen or El Manar, the point of it is to quiet the facts of the matter, which are illegal criminal warfare. And the more that these Lebanese journalists and these Palestinian journalists are willing to resist, because they are the resistance, people really, really, really have to understand that if you're a journalist in these areas, it's as much of a resistance, a decision to resist, as becoming an armed soldier in some group. Like it's an honor, but it's also a real duty to these people, because you're seeing things on the ground, for instance, that are being manipulated into like reductive narratives. And I was in Gaza last year. I went with Glia. I was sort of snuck in as a medical logistics coordinator, which I really did. And then I reported on the side. And when you're there, you realize that reporting becomes an act of extreme bravery when you didn't realize that you can't almost process how dangerous it is until you're on the ground and you're realizing, like, in my opinion, not only are they targeting journalists and medics, they're almost, this might be controversial to say, but I don't know that they're targeting anyone on. I think that they're using AI in such a way that they actually don't care who they're targeting, that it doesn't matter, that actually we're that important as Arabs. And then there's the other argument, which I also buy into. That's one argument that I think is plausible, that like it's just AI, it's just lavender system or whatever that reporting was. And then there's this other idea that they're actually targeting systematically people that are threatened to them essentially, which is resistance members, journalists. And I think that's also really plausible. But it's hard to say that the people they're targeting are going to go away. I think we all know that. Hezbollah started because of them and will continue to fight them because there is a fight to have, right? Like the southern part of Lebanon isn't Israel, and it's never going to be Israel no matter how much they want it to be Israel. And whether it's Hezbollah or it's another group that's communist or leftist or progressive, there are so many different groups that are willing to stand on business, whether it's with an armed resistance or a journalistic resistance or a medical resistance or an educational resistance. The people of this land have nothing else to do. There is no other economy to work with. They're either resisting or they're fleeing. And they're the types of people that have been on this land for 1,000 years. So they're not going to just easily flee. They can't leave. They don't have all of these opportunities. So ultimately, one thing that I really appreciate about being a journalist in Lebanon and having been a journalist in Palestine is that the degree to which journalists work together and collectively understand that the collective of fact, documenting fact is so much larger than the individual ego, which I think we get lost with in the West. Even, of course, me in New York City now, like I get lost. Like, oh, everybody wants to be a star in the USA. Like everybody wants to be rich and famous just for no reason. And in the Middle East, it becomes like the stakes are way higher. And I think in the United States, we're a really big country. We can know a thing and feel it, But in Lebanon, it's so small that it's not just knowing it and feeling it, it's actually literally experiencing it through one person or another. And that kind of degree of closeness, it changes the fabric of how you move. So in a way, like being a journalist in Lebanon and in Palestine, I've felt a support and a love for my colleagues that can only really happen when it's so bad that fighting is like being competitive or even just being like really like individualistic about it isn't even on the table, you know?
I want to remind listeners that you're tuned to the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio, and I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff, and I am speaking right now to Lebanese-American journalist Afeef Nessouli. And I think, because I work oftentimes doing media trainings for journalists and for folks on the front line. And one of the things that folks on the front line have complained about for a long time in the US is the extractive kind of journalism. Like, oh, I'm just here for my byline. I just want to extract a story out of you and then I'm gone. I don't care what happens to you. I don't care if this pipeline gets built or if you all end up in jail. And I think a part of that is, yes, the very individualistic way that we're programmed in this country, and also that because we're from there is no American culture, right? There's no like American experience. It's so broad that people don't relate, you know, like if you have a journalist from New York that goes down to report in Appalachia or in New Orleans, it's like they don't see themselves as the people that they're reporting on. So it's much easier to be extractive with somebody when you don't have a relationship where you're like, wow, I'm talking about my people. I am the people talking through myself. And as you pointed out, like these journalists in Lebanon and Palestine, like they are part of this story because they're all living under this occupation, under this violent terrorism that's meted out by Israel. And I think that that's, you know, something that a lot of U.S. journalists could learn from, among many other lessons. But, you know, you mentioned medics as well, and I wanted to get onto this as well, because this is something that also never gets coverage here. And even in alternative media, it's not talked about a lot, is the so-called double tap strikes, where Israel will target a place once and then wait until first responders are present and then strike again with the aim of killing those that are there expressly to save lives. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and specifically how you see that showing up right now in Lebanon.
Yeah, I experienced this most heavily in Gaza before I get to Lebanon. I visited the civil defense force there, and it was a bunch of guys that are like 19 to 24-year-old, basically emergency responders who have to time their strategy. And they went into real detail with me, and I did an interview with someone about this. And a lot of my stuff is on Instagram, so it's not like always reported in a like big heavy publication. But this guy told me he was like 22, and he was like, basically, you go and you try to cover the area as quickly as possible, and then you have to take cover because you only have like a minute to just try to save as many people or like get eyes on where people are, because they, you know, where voices are rubble. And then, you know, another strike is happening because they want to optimize the amount of deaths they can get. So the double tap strike is something that they use a lot in Nabatieh, and they've been reported in the South. They've been, you know, sort of been using this tactic to kind of create a situation in the South that's unlivable, right? Like, and it's because they deliberately want to take the South. They want the Litani and the South. They want the Litani River to be the northern border. So I think when you see things like double taps, strikes, and you see hitting hospitals, and you see hitting residential buildings, and you see the laying flat of towns and then roads being paved over them for military access by the IDF, you're realizing I have a friend who literally has a family building who has a military access road paved over it. It just means they're never going to be able to go, they're not going to be able to rebuild their house. They don't, I mean, think about it just personally, like you're just so tired, you're like, whatever, it's over now. And that kind of, all of these tactics of cruelty are so that people just leave. They just stop resisting, because resistance is a lot of work. This has been going on, actually. This has not stopped. This has been an ongoing resistance, an ongoing fight in this on the border. I mean, since the early 2000s, they were occupying for 15 years. And so this is all for a real reason. And it looks as though they're facing another iteration of occupation in the coming months if something isn't done to help stop that.
Yeah, and of course the tactic of ripping people from their home place, that's a colonizer tactic going back, to the founding of the US and European colonization. So yeah, fascists of a feather. And I wanted to ask you, kind of wrapping up here, because you mentioned, unless something is done, and of course you mentioned that there's armed resistance groups and things like that. I'm curious what is happening. Like, I understand that people are disappointed with how the Lebanese government just seems to be kind of begging Israel for talks, or like, hey, well, whatever you need, like, we'll figure it out. So what's the status there? And also in terms of any kind of regional back and forth, there is a connection between Iran. Iran has already said that what they're doing is also on in part for Palestine. So could you talk a little bit about that, like, regional collection of responses and what you see happening, understanding you don't have a crystal ball, but what you see happening with regards to the situation there?
So as far as the government is going, I think people are really frustrated at the fact that Lebanon is just it's small and it's not going to be able to respond to both a psychotic neighbor and then all original anti-imperialist, but sort of sometimes imperialist force. And the fact of the matter is that they've done things like converted stadiums, converted schools. They are working with NGOs to feed people. They're doing things that they can. I have to acknowledge that they're doing a lot of different kinds of measures to respond. The fact, though, is that there been a government embroiled in corruption, and they've been under the thumb of the US and Israel and Saudi, and parts of the government have been split up, right? So you have Hezbollah, which is definitely part of the government, been part of the government for a while, that's under Iran's influence. And then you have Nawaf Saddam, the prime minister, who's sort of begging Israel for acknowledgement, taking out Iranian diplomat and getting nothing for it. And I think in the Middle East, Lebanon is regarded as this place that, I think it's a gem, because it's a place that Arabs come to feel spiritually free. It is scholastically free. It is diverse. There are different kinds of people there. They are able to cohabitate, whether they're extremely religious Christians or Muslims or extremely progressive communists, like leftists in Hamra. The country is diverse and they get each other. It's been spliced and diced because it offers different people different things. I think Lebanese people are exhausted of this cycle of having to step up, because what you eventually see is, because the government can't do everything, the resistance comes down to, I was a young woman named Yara. She's in her early 30s. She has her own response initiative outside of a park in Lebanon. Like I said, her and her colleagues, her volunteer, her friends, her colleagues, everybody who's volunteering with her, they're able to get hot meal out of her of a makeshift kitchen out of a cafe that's this leftist cafe. They're getting 1,000 meals out and passing them out, and really documenting people's needs and going back to them and answering their needs and getting them medication and doing it hand by hand. Truly, it's so much tedious work that comes down to just a regular person, regular people. It's something that I think that is important to always out is the helpers. I know it's cheesy and lame, but it's that's what makes me feel a lot of hope in Lebanon, is that the fact of the matter is these people have been in a cycle and a loop of violence for so long that has nothing to do with them. It has to do with leaders above them manipulating their life, their daily lives. And what they've become is extremely good at helping each other, and extremely good at leaning on each other and becoming community and becoming, breaking through, transcending sectarian lines and giving each other space to break free from these patterns. And I just think that ultimately Lebanon is going to be a playground for what the world is doing at large, right? We're just the place where the powers show down, and it's not fair. And I think the only thing that I can see that gives me hope are the people who are in their 30s now and in their 20s now, who are so aware of the failures of their predecessors, and so aware of the failures politically and also just sort of socially, because it is a beautiful place that has a lot of reason. It is not a lost cause. And the people, most of all, have really made me realize that.
That's beautiful. And I think a beautiful way to wrap it up. Obviously, just hearing you speak, it's like, wow, there's so much that we can learn and share, and that kind of solidarity. We could really use those lessons here. So as an organizer, I really also appreciate you highlighting that. So again, folks, you can read some of Afeef's work, including an article that I pulled from at The Intercept. He is again also the host of With Afeef Nessouli, a weekly live stream and interview show about suppressed news. Afeef, thank you so much for coming on the show.
I really appreciate you so much.
You're listening to the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio, and I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield. Coming up next, my co-host, Mickey Huff, sits down with former director of student media at Indiana University, Jim Rodenbush, to talk about his termination. That's coming up right now, so please stay with us.
Welcome to the Project Censored show on Pacifica Radio. I'm Mickey Huff with Eleanor Goldfield. Today, silencing student reporters threatens public's right to know. Our guest today is Jim Rodenbush, and he has worked with award-winning student media organizations helping to mentor the next generation of journalists for the past 16 years. Most recently, Jim served as director of student media at Indiana University and taught in the media school. During his time there, the Indiana Daily Student won 12 Pacemaker Awards and was twice named College Media Outlet of the Year. Jim Rodenbush, welcome to the program today.
Thank you for having me.
You just wrote an amazing piece for us at Project Censored online, Silencing Student Reporters Threatens Public Right to Know. And of course, the reason that you were sort of thrust into the limelight, you had a pretty serious run-in with folks over at Indiana University, or I should say they had a run-in with you. Could you tell our audience a little bit about your background and your time at Indiana University, and of course, the fiasco that kind of took place there that led the college to dismiss you from your position? And so, Jim Rodenbush, tell us a little bit about what happened at Indiana University.
Yeah, so I came to Indiana in the summer of 2018, about a year or so ago, is when the situation with IU really started to unfold. There had been some budget decisions that had been made. At the time, the print edition of the IDS had been changed from weekly to approximately once every 2 weeks. But what happened progressively as that decision was made was that I had begun to hear from my direct supervisor that there was concerns from the university level, specifically the provost of the university, that the provost was still seeing copies, traditional news copies of the IDS on newsstands. When they had made the budget decision to go from weekly to, once every couple of weeks, they had leaned into this idea that they would be special editions of the newspaper, promotional content within the newspaper, anything that would have been something positive, or, hey, welcome to campus, of like a visitor's guide, homecoming edition, a sports preview, fun stuff, but nothing that would lean toward a traditional front page newspaper. And that had progressed where it went from, hey, we're concerned about the traditional newspaper still being in the newsstands, to shifting over to, we need you to make sure that there are no traditional newspapers in the newsstands. It went from a suggestion and a concern to what I felt was an order. And in my role, we had direct language with my job description that indicated that the student leaders and the student editors were the ones that were responsible for the content. And that is the message that I relayed to them. On top of that, Indiana University is a public university. And so, the student reporters have basic First Amendment rights to practice journalism. And so the idea that I somehow would be the one to say, hey, your newspaper can no longer be a newspaper. It specifically has to be a piece of promotional content, which just wasn't something that I was willing to do.
So, in other words, the provost's office or the administration at the college wanted to turn it into a PR organ for the campus and basically strip it from any actual journalism or reporting that was going on around the community?
Yes, and it was specifically to the print edition. The forward-facing thing, as I ended up telling students, that parents would see, that people walking on campus would see. They were interested in having no traditional news be in that paper.
Yeah, curiously, it's a newspaper without news. Again, this is curious because it's a public university and there are pretty well-known guidelines and rules. Administrators, I mean, even the faculty advisor, even you're not supposed to meddle with the content of the student paper.
No, because I was an employee of Indiana University, which made me part of that institution. And, the conversations that I attempted to have with administrators, and obviously they didn't go well or we wouldn't be having this conversation, is that, the university was in a position where it could make all the budget decisions it wanted to. And it did, taking the paper from weekly to once every 2 weeks was a clear-cut budget decision that they were allowed to make. They crossed the line when that budget decision became connected to content. Like it had to be content neutral. The second that it no longer became content neutral is when you're in fact messing with the First Amendment rights and you're going into censorship of the paper. To me, it's simple.
It seems like a cut and dry case, man. And I mean, it seems, I mean, having this experience myself, having, chaired a journalism program in California for 5 years through a revitalization stage, it was made very clear to me at multiple stages that I, as the department chair, had no say over the content of the student paper. The faculty advisor that was put in place and faculty member was not supposed to guide the content. They weren't supposed to help students write the stories. So if we're not able as a faculty or as an advisor or as a chair, the people that are more intimately involved in it, I mean, how do people that are completely disassociated with it, that don't usually understand anything even about journalism, but what do you suspect that this was all part of a longer play to gradually just strip, or to take the teeth out of the paper and turn it into an advertisement for the college? Or was there any particular articles that maybe students were writing per se? I think that there was a piece from Foundation of Individual Rights and Expression on campus expression and free speech issues. Was that something that triggered anything at the campus?
If it did, those conversations were not happening, with me. And the thing about the Indiana Daily Student is that its journalism has had teeth to it forever. And that was part of the reasons why coming to the IDS was such a huge, professional thing for me. Like, it covers the university hard. It covers the community hard. And it is, at that point, it had been 7 to 8 years of the students delivering really top-notch journalism. And so for it to be a thing overnight where they decided that they didn't want this to happen suddenly, I mean, to me, it just doesn't make any sense, because yes, you may in fact think that you're exerting content over the printed edition, but the IDS has a massive online audience and all the articles are still appearing there.
If there was some shift in the administration, I mean, other than what you described, some of the shuffling, but if there was a shift in an attitude towards the student paper, you were completely unaware of that.
I would say yes and no. The greater, and I would be speculating because I just simply was not a part of these conversations. But I can say to you that it was my last couple of years at IU, and the issues that surrounded the IDS, they corresponded with what would be logically described as a volatile time on the campus as well. IU was at the center of campus demonstrations that were going on. IU was at the focus of the state government, to where there were huge budget cuts that impacted every part of campus. And just the general, existence of campus life in the United States in 2026, like IU has been a part of that. And so the logical thing would be that this was just a culmination that the IDS happened to be a part of. And that was this idea that perhaps the university was trying really, really hard not to get the attention of anyone for anything negative. And while you can't control what's happening online, you can control what people see when they walk on your campus. And again, I'm connecting dots here as a result of meetings that I was not participating in. But to point the IDS as kind of a fallout of a larger issues going on at IU, that would be a very reasonable conclusion.
Yeah, I want to get to some other details. Maybe you can share a few other details of some of the specifics that happened. But again, as I know, this case ended up attracting quite a bit of attention in the media. And of course, it attracted the attention of the Student Press Law Center, right? And you even have your own IU censorship tracker going on over there that's following your case. I mean, the SPLC.org, those folks, they're pretty serious about maintaining press freedom on college campuses, I can tell you.
And anywhere that there's a thriving journalism program at the university level, that's nothing but good news for everybody. Like that kind of teaching and that kind of learning lab that you can provide for future journalists is again, nothing but great news.
I'd like to remind our listeners that you're tuned to the Project Censored show. I am Mickey Huff with Eleanor Goldfield, and in this segment of the program today, we're speaking with Jim Rodenbush, who was at Indiana University and oversaw the Indiana Daily Student, the award-winning newspaper at Indiana University, and was let go. Basically, my understanding is you were standing up for rights of students to print stories as they saw fit and resist intervention from university administrators. That's accurate, Jim Rodenbush?
100% accurate.
So had you had these experiences before? You said this was your fourth college that you were privileged to be part of. And, based on the things that you were just saying before the break, it sounds like you're a really passionate and committed educator. You really care about the future of journalism and student journalism. Had you experienced anything like this at your other positions?
No. Part of the deal in being in a forward-facing role within student media, is that you're going to get questions and concerns and opinions from those at a faculty and administrative level. That's absolutely part of the deal. And so over the years, sure, you'll hear from upset audiences. But in terms of you need to do this or else kind of directive or order, it literally never happened to me until it happened to me. And so this was absolutely a first-time experience.
So you sound like you were blindsided. I mean, you sound like it did kind of come out of, I think the degree to which that things escalated seemed shocking.
Yeah, and I've been asked I've been asked this question because it's an obvious, like, were you surprised or were you expecting it? And it's equal parts yes and no. You mentioned the Student Press Law Center. Kudos to them for everything that they do, and they were and have continued to be such a huge help to me. And as things were escalating at IU, I did reach out to the SPLC. I'm sure they wouldn't mind me telling the world that. And one of the conversations that I had with them was like, what should I do if I get fired? That being said, walking into that appointment on that afternoon, it's almost like shocked but not shocked. If I had to be surprised by one thing, I would be surprised by how quickly it happened. Because once this truly escalated, you're talking about less than a month. And I would have guessed perhaps a couple of steps in between to go right from the situation to the worst case scenario. That how quickly that happened was probably the most surprising part.
Curiosity, what job protections did you have at the public university? Was it a tenured position?
No, I was considered a staff member at IU.
Right.
And so to that end, zero. So
no staff union, no other job protection there?
No, not for me personally. I mean, they
right.
Obviously, there are protections for tenured faculty, and there's some, graduate student, happenings where they're trying to get those protections at that level. But for me as a full-time staff member in the role that I had, no, there was none.
That's pretty riveting. Also shows the state of labor in this country, I suppose. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that don't have protections, but you would think, and many would think, that at a public university that someone in your position would have some kind of protection and recourse. And it sounds like you didn't have a lot of protection, and it sounds like your only recourse is through the courts.
Yeah. And again, kudos to the SPLC. They were able to connect me with representation in the state of Indiana. And a couple of weeks after my firing, there was a lawsuit filed on my behalf.
I don't know if you are at liberty to speak about this, but I'll put it out there anyway. I can only imagine that you had a rapport with your student staff. What was their reaction to what had happened?
Well, my relationship, particularly with my student leaders, was very open. And so, again, those student leaders in particular were aware that this was going on as it was going on, because, one of the things that I would tell them repeatedly is that what I know, they know. And so they were very, very aware that something was building. They were among the first to learn, when I was fired. And, they shared that information with their own staffs. And so the lines of communication here, they were, unfortunately fully involved in things that were going on.
So your case has, again, attracted a lot of attention. You mentioned in the article you wrote that it brought national attention and support, including recognition from the Radio, Television, Digital News Association Foundation with a 2026 First Amendment Award. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, they reached out to me in early 2026, telling me that I had been, selected as one of the people to, receive this award. And my wife and I traveled back to Washington, where all these things are happening, 2 weeks ago for this dinner and to receive this award. And I tell you, there have been a lot of people that have reached out, and that support has been incredible. But this moment in particular was really impactful from my end, because it put me in a room filled with hundreds of like-minded people. This is a big deal, what was happening. And the thing that I can take away from it is, again, heartening to be around so many people that understand and that are there with you. Because as you're going through the situation, or as I was going through the situation at Indiana University, I was always the lone dissenting voice in the room. And when you're being told how wrong you are about the things that you were saying and the stance that you're taking, you can get to the point where you start to question whether you're kind of losing your mind a little bit. And so to be able to kind of have that moment where it's recognized, so like, yes, we hear you, we understand you, we stand with you, that was a huge deal.
Jim, we're in that room with you. We're all cheering you on, and we certainly stand with you at Project Censored. It just sounds like you've had a pretty harrowing year. It's good to see, however, that you've got such great support, and you do have so many people that now know your story. And again, it's of course very impactful to your life, what's happening to you directly. But you point out in your piece that this is part of a much broader pattern of attacks on the press, and particularly student press. What are some lessons maybe you suggest to our audience that we should take away from this? And I'm assuming one of them is vigilance for sure. But what can you tell us about that? And how are some ways maybe that people can support you and other student press publications?
I had thought for the longest time, because again, I was in my 16th year with student publications. I had thought for the longest time that, issues that face the professional level were just issues that were never going to make their way to this extent to college publications. And I was spectacularly wrong on that. And I think that's a huge lesson to take away for everyone, is that if this can happen at one of the preeminent student media publications in the country, it can happen anywhere. And so, the lesson is to pay attention to what's going on. The lesson is to be vocally loud when things are happening, when things smell funny, when things look different. The lesson is to understand who your advocacy groups are, because FIRE and SPLC, they are ready to protect and defend you vigorously. And so, again, to be aware, to understand your rights, to understand who your advocates are. These are all things that are just, unfortunately, part of the business at this point. And it's really on anyone who's participating, even as an audience, like, engage with the content. If there's an outlet that you are particularly fond of or invested in, like, be present. It's going to take everyone to be loud in protecting, basic First Amendment rights in order for, student, and, this is journalism in general, but for student media organizations specifically, to continue to grow and thrive and do the work that they're there to do.
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. And I think that, you make so many good points here. You come to the end of your article saying free expression is not guaranteed. We must actively defend it in classrooms, newsrooms, and in every space where truth risks being silenced. And in 2026, Jim Rodenbush, when we look around in the United States, there are great risks for truths being silenced.
It's a reflection. As I said, I never thought it would reach the student media level, but we are asking student journalists these days to do professional level work. And the IDS, I would tell people it was as close to being a professional newsroom without as close as possible. And so if we are asking this of our student journalists, we have to expect that the risks are going to mirror that of professional newsrooms.
Yeah, I have to just give a shout out. I couldn't agree with you more. Shout out to my old college DVC, the Inquirer. I mean, award-winning student paper that, has gone through some rough times and came out the other end. And of course, at Ithaca College, the Ithacan, just an absolutely incredible paper. The students do absolutely amazing work that is very much on the professional level of community journalism. And so much now, if colleges are lucky enough to have a journalism program, in many cases, they're functioning as a news organization in an otherwise news desert climate. And so you students are really rising to the level of the kind of reporting that we really need to see. And Jim Rodenbush, it's just an honor to talk to you, and I appreciate you taking your time to talk to us about your story. But I appreciate even more that your courage and how you stood up for not only what you believe in, but stood up for the rights of students. And you paid a price for it. And I know that you have a lawsuit going on, and I really hope that you get the justice that you so richly deserve.
Thank you.
We wanna smash, crash, bash, mash, blast the system. We wanna get it hype, get it live, get with the mission. We want the crowd loud, this pumping rhythm is hitting. We wanna make it clear, we ain't scared. This is the...
That does it for another episode of the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your producer and co-host Eleanor Goldfield, along with my co-host and executive producer Mickey Huff. For more information about all the things that the project does, from the classroom to the radio waves, please check out projectcensored.org. I'd also like to remind listeners that the views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Project Censored. This broadcast is intended for educational purposes as part of our mission to promote critical media literacy, independent journalism, and civic engagement. We aim to foster thoughtful dialogue and encourage listeners to think critically about the information that they receive from all media sources. Project Censored is a 501c3 nonprofit organization and does not endorse or oppose any candidate for public office. We have a lot of tools, resources, and information over at our website. Again, that's projectcensored.org. Please also follow us on social media at Project Censored. As always, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Unspeakable times, stakes tied, thinkable crimes perpetrated by the criminal minds with political ties, habitualized alibis, disguised under the guise of democracy, politics, and the apocalypse. Got the skies looking ominous. So the ocean burned bright with waves full of poison. Genocide wars fought for little poison. The weapons manufactured paid for by taxing while the bridges and the levees and the mines collapsing. All the prisons build the capacity citizens. Hypnotized by the master thief. Combine and conquer, steal a masterpiece. Open your eyes and realize what's happening. Time's running out to reach all potential. If you ain't at the table, then you're probably on the menu. We got that love, we lift our brothers and our sisters. The people together can overthrow the system. We got that love, uplift your brothers and your sisters. The people organized can build the kind of future we want. Smash, crash, bash, mash, blast the system. We wanna get it hype, get it live, get with the mission. We want the crowd loud. This pumping rhythm is hitting. We wanna...
KPFA continues its 77th birthday celebrations with a benefit performance featuring Grammy-nominated John Santos Sextet.
Saturday, May 23rd at La Peña Cultural Center, 3105 Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley.
Doors open at 7 p.m. and the show starts at 8 p.m.
This event is hosted by us, Joanna Manqueros and
Tawfiq Halabi. More information is available at kpfa.org/events.
Miss today's newscast? Worry not. At KPFA, we get it. Life moves fast. That's why every headline, every deep dive, every voice that matters is waiting for you at kpfa.org. Head to the archives and catch the latest broadcast on your time. When time slips away, KPFA's got you. KPFA, vigilant as always.
Steal This Story, Please. Sunday, April 19th at 6:30 p.m. at the Rialto Elmwood in Berkeley. A new documentary on Amy Goodman, followed by a live interview with W. Kamau Bell, introduced by KPFA's Brian Edwards Teaker. A portrait of journalism committed to truth-telling across decades of conflict, resistance, and change, from the front lines to the daily work of Democracy Now! A night of film, journalism, celebration, and conversation. More info at kpfa.org.
This is 94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, everywhere at kpfa.org.
KPFA.